Vince, let me start with this. There's a famous quote from Norman Mailer regarding the JFK assassination, in which he says that we cannot accept that a small, lonely man felled a giant in the midst of his limousine, his legions, his throng, his security. If such a non-entity destroyed the leader of the most powerful nation on earth, then a world of disproportion engulfs us, and we live in a universe that is absurd. Does that define why so many people, in part, seem to have such difficulty accepting that Lee Harvey Oswald murdered JFK?
Yes, it is. But of course, it's strictly visceral and completely devoid of all logic. But there is no question that people found it, at least millions did, intellectually incongruous that someone whom they perceived to be a king could be struck down by a nonentity. Here is Kennedy, captivating a world audience with his wit and his charm and intelligence. It's a gloriously bright fall day in Dallas. The president is riding in his presidential limousine, and his lovely wife, Jacqueline, is seated to his left. They're smiling, waving to the crowd, and a second later, it's all over with. And there was this sense among millions that something more just had to be involved, as Mailer is suggesting, but obviously nothing more has to be involved at all. Bullets are very democratic. They kill or injure whomever they hit, and it doesn't take anyone special or important to pull the trigger. Let me make an observation that is not well known except to students of the assassination. When the Warren Commission came out with their report in September of 1964, the majority of Americans, 55%, accepted the findings of the Warren Commission that Oswald killed Kennedy and acted alone. But there were millions, I think it was about 33%, who immediately felt there must be a conspiracy here. But through the years, with their blizzard of, books, radio and TV talk shows, movies, college lectures, etc., the shrill voice of the conspiracy theorists finally penetrated the consciousness of the American people and convinced the majority of Americans, right now, I don't know what the percentage is, I hear 60, 70, 80% in various polls, that there was a conspiracy and that Oswald was either a member of a high-level conspiracy to kill the president, or he was just some patsy who was framed by an elaborate group of conspirators ranging from anti-Castro Cuban exiles to organized crime working in a league with U.S. intelligence. But I'm not going to compare the conspiracy theorists with the Third Reich. However, Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister of the Third Reich, said something that is applicable here. And he said that if you push something at someone long enough, eventually they're going to start buying it, particularly if they're not exposed to any contrary view. There's about 1,000 books on the assassination. At least 95% of them are pro-conspiracy books. So the American people have been inundated with this, and now they've gone along with this nonsense.
How much does the Warren Commission, its investigation, how much has that did that open the door? Because one of the theories is that even among those who believe, like you have written so beautifully regarding this and effectively regarding this issue in Reclaiming History, there is the feeling that, well, that some of this was because of information that was suppressed, because there may have been covering your butt activity going on in the front end that did lend to the conspiracy theorists having a window to at least try to bust through. Do you buy that?
Well, I'm not exactly sure. You're saying there's an allegation that the Warren Commission suppressed evidence. Is that correct?
That maybe not for not for reasons of there was this big conspiracy, that they did not do as thorough a job to answer all of the questions, in part because of the possibility that the FBI was concerned that if it had really done its job on information it had on Oswald, even if he's acting alone, they might have been able to act upon that information?
Well, I'll tell you what. I don't know if it's because I'm from Hibbing. I don't think so, but there's no more critical person on the face of this earth than I. I'm extremely critical. I told Geraldo one time, I was just on Geraldo Saturday night, by the way, but I told him a long time ago, I said, Geraldo, I'd find fault with a beautiful morning sunrise. And so I'm an extremely critical person, and I tell you, in my opinion, the Warren Commission never suppressed anything, and they did an excellent job of investigation. They worked on this thing for 10 months. The people involved in the Warren Commission, tremendous people of tremendous honor and integrity. You know, Chief Justice Earl Warren was such an honorable person that when he ran for re-election here in California as governor, he got the support, the endorsement of both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And if anyone thinks that people like Warren near the end of his career, there was Jerry Ford, there was John McCloy, the former president of the World Bank. These people, all they're thinking about, or the main thing they're thinking about, is their legacy. If you think they're going to do something that could ruin their legacy, their reputation, end up putting them behind bars, because if you cover up, you know what you're guilty of? You're guilty of accessory after the fact to murder. So these are just ramblings and allegations by people, but there's no evidence that the Warren Commission suppressed anything.
Vince Bugliosi is our guest, famed prosecutor and writer. Let's try to narrow this down, as big an area as it is, in the time that we have, to three major areas, starting with the so-called magic bullet. What would you say is the biggest misconception that your average individual who tends to believe in conspiracy theories has about the so-called magic bullet?
Well, in my book, Reclaiming History, I answer that question like all questions. I might say this about the book, because I'm not sure that it's clear that I have a book out there on the assassination. With all my books in the past, even Helter Skelter, the biggest-selling true crime book in publishing history, In Cold Blood is number 2, whenever I would go on a show like yours, Dan, and I've been on your show before, and I always enjoy being on your show, I never would boast about the book. I would just simply tell the reader or tell the listener what the book's about. I can't do that with Reclaiming History. If I did not be honest and boast about the book, I would be misleading people. They would think, well, it's just another book, another of the 1,000 books on the assassination. It's not. It's a very, very special book, and review after review said that it's the definitive book on the assassination. Some have gone further, Dan, and said something that I think you'll agree you just don't hear in a review. They've said it's the final word on the assassination, which is remarkable for a book on a subject that's the most controversial subject in American history. The magic bullet is just one of everything that I answer in the book. There's nothing that I don't answer. Plus, I have answers to questions that people wouldn't even dream of asking. But you asked me a very good question about the magic bullet. Now, here's the story of the magic bullet. There was no magic bullet. It was just an invention and a myth of the conspiracy theorists. What they do in their sketches, they place Governor Connally directly in front of President Kennedy in the presidential limousine, which he was not, and then they argue that a bullet coming from the president's right rear and traveling on a downward trajectory and passing on a straight line through soft tissue in Kennedy's body, once it exited the front of the president's throat, to hit Connally, it would have had to make a right turn in midair and then make a left turn in midair. Of course, if you start out from an erroneous premise, everything that follows makes a heck of a lot of sense, Dan, but as you know, the problem is that it's wrong. That's the only problem, even though it makes a lot of sense, because you start out with a wrong premise. Connally was not seated directly in front of Kennedy. He was seated to Kennedy's left front in a jump seat. So therefore, the orientation of Connolly's body vis-a-vis Kennedy's in the presidential limousine was such that once that bullet exited the front of the president's throat, it had to go on and hit Connolly for the simple reason it had nowhere else to go. Now, I don't know if you're aware, Dan, that I, quote, prosecuted Oswald in London in 1986. Were you aware of that?
I was. We've talked about it before, actually, yes.
Yeah, Jerry Spence defended Oswald, and Spence called Dr. Cyril Wecht to the witness stand in London. Wecht is the chief pathologist for the conspiracy community, and he asked Wecht to characterize that bullet. And Wecht said, well, Mr. Spence, bullets don't make right or left turns in midair, not even in cartoons. It's a magic bullet. On cross-examination, I said, now, Dr. Wecht, if this bullet passed on a straight line through soft tissue in Kennedy's body, as you admit that it did, but did not go on and hit Connolly, as you claim it did not, why didn't it tear up the interior of the limousine, or hit the driver, or anyone else, or anything else? And he said, well, Mr. Bugliosi, I didn't conduct the investigation in this case. This is not a question for me to answer. And I said, no, wait a while, Dr. Wecht. It looks like you have your own magic bullet. If that bullet, after it exited the front of the president's throat, did not go on to hit Connolly, did not tear up the interior of the limousine, did not hit the driver or anything or anyone else, it must have zigzagged to the left. I was just being sarcastic, of course. Sure. The jury knew that. He said, no, it did not zigzag to the left. I said, did it hop, skip, and jump over the car? And he said, no, it did not have to perform any remarkable feat. And then I said, well, then, tell this jury, Dr. Wecht, what happened to that bullet after it exited the front of the president's throat? And he paused, Dan, and he said, I don't know. Now, if we're to believe what the conspiracy theorists say, after that bullet exited the front of the president's throat, apparently it vanished without a trace into thin air. And the terrible irony here is that the conspiracy community has wrapped that magic bullet tag, as you well know, Dan, around the neck of the Warren Commission, successfully, I might add, for 50 years. But when you really look at the evidence, they're the ones that have the magic bullet. That's a long answer to your question, but it's a sophisticated issue.
It is, and here's what fascinates me about this part of it. It's so central to almost all of the conspiracy theories, and when it is so demonstrably, provably based on a false premise, as you said, that they were lined up in front of each other, how does it still have a life this much after, given how easily, as I said, dismissed it is, as you've just done?
Well, but how often do you hear someone like me explaining it the way I am? I mean, millions of people saw Oliver Stone's, what's the word for a phony movie? I can't think of the name right now.
Well, fiction.
Yeah, I mean, it was just just one lie after another. Millions of people saw that movie. And he had, among many, many other lies, he showed Connolly seated directly in front of Kennedy. So you say, how does this thing have any legs and survive? More people saw that movie than have heard me articulate what I just told your good folks up in Minneapolis.
Vince Bugliosi is our guest, famed prosecutor, going all the way back, of course, to Helter Skelter days. His book, JFK book, well, there's, I think, really a couple of them. There's Reclaiming History, which is the big one, and for me, the definitive final word. And then there's I believe another one that's come out again recently that is called 4 Days in November, which focuses on the 4 days as well for people who might want to just distill to that section.
Well, there actually is, 4 Days in November is simply the first section of Reclaiming History.
Correct.
It's identical. The first four, it's called 4 Days in November. Now, interestingly enough, there's a third book out there now. Tom Hanks made a movie out of a part of Reclaiming History, and it focused on the president's death at Parkland Hospital.
Right.
So there's another book out there right now called Parkland as a tie-in to the movie. But Parkland is identical to 4 Days November. The only difference is the cover. They're tying the cover in with the movie. The movie has already been on the screen. It's opening in Europe now, and it's called Parkland. But that's just the first section of Reclaiming History. Reclaiming History is worked on it for 20 years. It's 1,650 pages, but then there's a CD at the end of another 1,000 pages.
Yep.
So I got sucked into the abyss and I couldn't get out. I was responding to all these nutty conspiracy theorists around the world, and it just never ended. And finally my editor said, Vince, we're going to press. If he hadn't done that, I'd probably still be writing the book. I'd be up to more than, it's the equivalent of 13 volumes, like I said, of 400-page books. I'd probably be up to 20 volumes now.
Let's talk about the so-called the president's head supposedly, appearing to move forward, and I believe frames
backward,
excuse me, to the rear. 312, 313. Are those the frames from the Zapruder film?
Right.
That's another key tenet of the conspiracy folks. Give us your best read on that and what your own research indicates.
Yeah, now there's an area where people legitimately, although incorrectly, but understandably, could think that there must be a conspiracy there. That was first shown on Geraldo Rivera's network show. It was called Good Night America in 1975, and a pirated copy of the Zapruder film was shown, in which the head snap to the rear was shown, and millions of people from that moment on said, well, there must have been a shot coming from the president's front where the grassy knoll was. As you know, Oswald was supposedly, and he was, but I'm saying, just for the sake of arguing, he was supposedly at the president's right rear in the book depository building. So they saw this head snap to the rear. Said, well, there must have been a shot coming from the president's right front. Now, at the trial in London, Spence showed that segment of the Zapruder film over and over again, at least 3 times, maybe as many as 4 or 5 times, and I didn't object. I let him have his fun. And Spence told the jury, it looked like Babe Ruth had grabbed his bat, swung as hard as he could, hit the president on the forehead, and knocked it backwards. And he says, Mr. Bugliosi, in his Wyoming patois, he says, Mr. Bugliosi is trying to convince you folks that what you saw with your very own eyes in the Zapruder film never even happened. And if I hadn't had an answer to that at the London trial, I think, Dan, it would have created a reasonable doubt, and the verdict would probably have been not guilty. But here's the answer. If you look at the individual frames of the Zapruder film, you cannot see it if you look at the film. At the film, all you see is a head snap to the rear. Look at the individual frames, which I put on the screen for the jury. It's a different story. At frame 312, the president's head's okay. At frame 313, the president is hit in the head. There's this explosion to his head. You can see it.
Yep.
And in what direction is the president's head pushed at frame 313? It's pushed slightly forward, 2.3 inches. So at the all-important moment of impact, 313, the president's head is pushed forward, indicating what? A shot from the rear where Oswald was. It was not pushed backwards. And then at frames 314 to 321, there's the 8-inch head snap to the rear. Now, the pathologist for the House Select Committee on Assassination said that was a neuromuscular reaction, nerve damage caused by the bullet entering the president's brain, caused his back muscles to tighten, which in turn caused his head to be thrust backwards. I might add parenthetically, and I think this is important, in 1967, which is 3 years after the Warren report, in '64, iTech Corporation put out a high contrast photo of frame 313, and you see all of this terrible spray of brain matter at 313, and it's all going to the front, again indicating a shot from the rear. But on the face of it, I can see where lay people would say, well, the shot must have come from the grassy knoll, and Oswald was to the rear, so there must have been a conspiracy. I can understand that. But there is an answer to it, and I think I've given you the answer on radio.
Let's talk also about the theories regarding Jack Ruby's role. That Jack Ruby, of course, was the guy who was going to shut Lee Harvey Oswald up before he might confess to a much grander conspiracy. That's another area you explore in much depth and much detail, and is fairly crucial to at least many of the conspiracy theorists. What do people need to know about him?
Okay. Dan, per usual, you always ask very good questions, and that's because you do your homework. That, like the previous two, is a very good question. When you hear people say Ruby silenced Oswald for the mob, what they're in fact saying, they may, well, I guess they may be thinking of it, but not necessarily. They're necessarily saying that Oswald killed Kennedy for the mob, because if Oswald hadn't killed Kennedy for the mob, there'd be no reason to silence him. And there's no evidence that Oswald killed Kennedy for organized crime. The other issue you should think about when we talk about the Ruby matter, if Ruby silenced Oswald for the mob, who was supposed to silence Jack Ruby? Jack Ruby lived an additional 3 years and died from natural causes. Let's talk about Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby, the FBI, House Select Committee, Warren Commission, concluded that he was not a member of organized crime, had no connections with organized crime. He did own 2 clubs, nightclubs in Dallas, one of which was a strip club, and he did come into contact, as he would be expected to do, with some low-level mobsters from time to time, but they were not mafioso, but they were just low-level mobsters around Dallas. Also, Jack Ruby wanted to give the impression that he had mob connections. He kind of dressed like a mobster. He wore a fedora hat like Al Capone used to wear. But it was all a facade. I might point out that Jack Ruby, when he testified before the Warren Commission, insisted on taking or being given a polygraph test on this issue of whether he was connected to organized crime or anyone when he shot and killed Oswald. He was given the test. He came out as clean as a hound's tooth, and the result of the test, as you know, is not conclusive. But I think it's very relevant that he insisted on taking a polygraph test. He had no way of knowing what the consequences would be. I mean, if he were guilty and he came across as being guilty on the test, that could only hurt him. Ruby would have been one of the worst people in the world for the mob to employ as a hitman. He was, among other things, very close to Dallas law enforcement. He loved the police. Literally used to hang out at the police station from time to time. He'd let police officers come to his club, the Carousel Club, free of cover charge. I mean, he'd go to their funerals or their weddings or whatever it was. He loved the police, so that's not the best person in the world if you're looking for someone to be a hitman to kill the president. Also, he was a notorious blabbermouth, unable to keep confidence in anything. He had severe emotional and mental problems. He was very violent. He used to get in fights with people at the club all the time over nothing. And I'm talking about fist fights. He had organic brain damage. He owned 7 dogs, Dan, 6 of whom he called his children, the 7th Sheba, his wife. Kind of a funny story, I think. one of the detectives for the Dallas Police Department. His name was Revell. I forget his first name. It may have been James Revell. Anyway,
James is right, yes.
He, did you get the right name?
Yes, that's right. That's the one.
Okay. He testified before the House Select Committee in 1978, and he told the committee, he said, listen, Jack Ruby is a buffoon, and I say this to the committee, if Jack Ruby was a member of organized crime, then the personnel director of organized crime should be replaced. Now, before we leave Ruby, let me address myself to this question, because I think it's a good question. Why did Jack Ruby kill Lee Harvey Oswald? And I think I have the answer to it. Jack Ruby loved John F. Kennedy. His psychiatrist said, and he used the word love not in a loose sense, but almost like a man-woman sense, loved John F. Kennedy. He thought Kennedy was the greatest man in history. He took his death extremely hard, cried throughout the assassination weekend. His sister Eva lived in Dallas at the time with Jack, not in the same apartment, but they saw each other every day. And Eva later moved to L.A., and I used to talk to her from time to time. And she said that when Kennedy died, she said, my brother Jack cried harder than when Ma and Pa died, unquote. There was a tremendous amount of hatred of Oswald, understandably, in our country. And Ruby shared that hatred of Oswald, and coupled with his love for Kennedy, I think undoubtedly that was a contributing factor as to why he killed Oswald. But there's another reason why he probably did. And that reason is that in his somewhat small mind, he thought, and actually it turned out correctly in a certain sense, he thought he was going to become a big hero. He killed a guy that killed the president. The people at the Carousel Club said, Jack wanted to become a hero. His prosecutor, Bill Alexander, told me Jack wanted to become a hero. Several jurors that sentenced him to death, convicted him of murder, sentenced him to death, said Jack wanted to become a hero. And we do know that from his jail cell, he sent out word he wanted an agent. He expected a book to be written about him, a movie. And his lawyer said, Jack just thought he was going to get a slap on the wrist for this thing. And in a short time, he'd be back at the Carousel Club, shaking the hands of people from around the world who came to shake his hand, shake the hands of the man who killed the president. And I might add that he did get letters and telegrams, Dan, from people, not just in the United States, around the world, congratulating him, saying he was a great man and he should be honored for what he did.
If Ruby had not killed Oswald, would you have written Reclaiming History, and would we be here talking about this today?
Oh, yeah, because Ruby killing Oswald is just one of the things that has led Americans to believe there's a conspiracy. That alone is not what changed the dime here. No.
Well, I guess what I'm asking is how much more, and how many more answers or questions, I guess you say, would have been answered if there indeed had been a trial? Or do you think this course, given who it was and the way conspiracy theorists work, that the locomotive was going to leave the station regardless of whether there had actually been a trial in which there might be greater resolution?
A trial in normal circumstances answers questions, not with these conspiracy theorists. No, it would have just created more. There would have been all types of allegations that people were getting paid off in line and all that stuff. I'm going to tell you something now, Dan, that you might say I'm not serious, I can't be serious, but I am serious because I know these people. You could have a film of Lee Harvey Oswald firing his Carcano rifle from the sixth-floor window on the day of the assassination, and I'm telling you, these people would say it was a staged film with an Oswald look-alike. This is a religion to them, and Dealey Plaza is the religion's sacred ground, It's a huge part of their lives. They go to these conventions down in Dallas every year. They subscribe to conspiracy newsletters. If they happen to be traveling to a city on their regular job, they're apt to stay overnight at the home of a fellow traveler. It's a big part of their life, and then I come along and basically tell them that they've wasted the last 20, 30 years of their life, and they obviously don't like me at all. I'm also telling them to forfeit the rest of their life because they look forward to these things, and nothing is going to convince them. A trial, normally you would say, would convince them. I don't believe so. Not these people. They were screaming the word conspiracy before the first bullet had even come to rest. I'm exaggerating there, but
not by much.
My point.
Vince Bugliosi is our guest. One other thing about Oswald that I believe you wrote about. It's been a while since I picked up your book in much depth, but isn't there something a bit off the cuff though about whatever conscious decision he made to kill Oswald, to the extent that, as I remember it, if the original schedule had been held to, Ruby would not have even been in position to take him out, that he was, in fact, I think, sending a telegram elsewhere, and it turned out they got a little bit behind schedule. Then he shows up and gets access anywhere he goes there, because, as you say, cops knew him very well, that if Oswald had been transported when he was supposed to, Ruby would not have even been there.
Yeah, well, you know this case pretty well, Dan. There's a fellow by name, I think his first name was Harry. I wrote the book in 2007, but I'm still on TV and everything right now because I think it's recognized as being the book on the assassination. But I think his name is Harry Holmes, and he was the head of the Postal Service. And they were interrogating Oswald at the Dallas Police Department, and Holmes showed up. And he said he had his own questions to ask Oswald. And that continued the period of time, ate up some more time, and lengthened the period. And Oswald ended up being transported downstairs. They were going to take him over to the Dallas Sheriff's Office at least a half hour later than it would have been if Holmes hadn't showed up. So if the transfer had been made when it was expected to be made, Ruby wouldn't have even been in the vicinity. As it was, he was at the Western Union getting a whatever you call
telegram.
A what?
A telegram, I believe.
Well, not a telegram. He was going to send a $25, whatever they call that.
Oh, a money order?
I guess a money order.
Yeah.
He was telegraphing. Telegraphing a $25 money order.
Gotcha.
To a stripper of his in Fort Worth. And then after that, he walked out, and the police department and the basement where Oswald was going to be brought down and then picked up by a car, that was about a block away, and he saw a group of people at the entrance there, and he didn't know exactly what it was. And he walked over there, and then he found out, that, of course, that Oswald was down below and hadn't been brought out yet from the jail on the basement floor. And he just walked right down there, and there Oswald was, and he shot him.
It doesn't exactly suggest a well thought out conspiracy. If he's going to take the chance of maybe I'll be there on time, maybe I won't be on there on time.
No.
Let's get into a couple of other areas, and I've kept it too long, but we always appreciate your time. This has been terrific for us. What is your best view on why Oswald killed JFK?
Okay. Now, I can answer that question. It's a funny thing, I was talking to a reporter from London last week, and I was saying that Reclaiming History answers all questions. Yep. And the first question from him was, why did Oswald kill Kennedy? I says, that's one question I cannot answer. No one's ever going to be able to answer that question. However, I think I do a better job in the book than has been put forth so far. Here's the problem with it. We can do that. I can get into that issue. it's not going to advance anything. It has nothing to do with the issue of guilt. It's just something that's nice to know. There are two areas that you may or may not want to get into, and that is, why do I believe Oswald's guilty, and why do I believe there's no conspiracy? I'll leave it up to you whether you want me to address myself to why Oswald killed Kennedy or address myself to the issues of guilt and conspiracy.
Well, I think we can stick with guilt, although I think you've already established that to a certain degree, and we've certainly over the years talked about that a lot. I can go either way. I know the question I ask is there is no right yes or no, right or wrong answer. However, I also trust someone who has been in the business of prosecuting as long as you have and has done the kind of research you've had to have, that as the backdrop and good gut feelings about, all right, playing off of what you have reported on, what you have learned regarding this case, that I think would make this interesting to people. Okay.
We'll talk about that. We won't get into why I believe there was no conspiracy. One reason, and of several that I would mention to you, I'll just toss it off, that if in fact a group was behind Lee Harvey Oswald, like the CIA or mob, after he shot Kennedy in Dealey Plaza and left the building, if the CIA or mob had gotten Oswald to shoot Kennedy for them, there would have been a car waiting for Lee Harvey Oswald to drive him to his death. That would have happened. And yet we know that Oswald was out on the street with $13 in his pocket trying to flag down buses and cabs. That tells any sensible person that Oswald acted alone. I mean, even the presidential motorcade route that took the limousine directly below the window where Oswald was, that route, Dan, wasn't even determined until November 18th,
right,
4 days before the assassination. Does anyone really believe that a conspiracy to murder the President of the United States would be hatched within just 4 days of the assassination? Now, on why would Oswald kill Kennedy, there's no way for anyone to know that for sure. Even if he were alive and wanted to convey to us why he did it, he might not be able to tell us all of the dynamics swirling around in his fevered brain that led to this monstrous act of murder. But there are certain things we do know about Oswald. One, he had delusions of grandeur. In fact, his diary was called the Historic Diary. One of his squad mates in the Marines said that Oswald wanted to do something that 10,000 years from now people would be talking about. His wife, Marina, whom I interviewed, said that Oswald read biographies of the great figures of history whom he compared himself with. So here was a guy who obviously wasn't just trying to create a ripple, but trying to change the tide of history. More specifically, Oswald loved and revered Fidel Castro. I mean, just 2 months earlier, as you know, Dan, he was down at the Cuban consulate in Mexico City, desperately trying to get an in-transit visa to Havana to help in the revolution down there. And we know that Kennedy was very supportive, although he didn't get actually involved with troops, supportive of the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, which angered Oswald. Also, 5 days before the assassination, Kennedy gave a foreign policy speech in Miami Beach in which he urged, all but urged the Cuban people to rise up against Castro, promising prompt U.S. aid if they did. And obviously Oswald did not like that. The Warren Commission and the House Select Committee both concluded that Oswald's love and passion for Castro and the Cuban Revolution played a role in why he killed Kennedy, and I agree with them on that. Now, here's something that I came up with which I had never heard or read before in terms of putting the dots together, and I'll just toss it out for your listeners as I did for the jury, Dan. Lee Harvey Oswald did not hate John F. Kennedy, apparently. I mean, he did not like certain things he did vis-a-vis Cuba, but he was very much in favor of Kennedy's civil rights bills. However, he had an enormous hatred for the United States of America. You're aware that he defected to the Soviet Union. When Marina was brought over here by him, the teacher English, didn't want her to learn English, and she picked up words here and there at the supermarket by looking at jars and the contents. So he hated the United States of America. And I came across something in my preparation for trial. Spence and I have both said that we worked just as hard on this murder case as any other murder case in our respective careers. In doing research, I came across something in his diary that leapt off the page to me, probably more so than the average person because of my involvement in the Manson case. Manson did not know the identity of the people he killed or had his minions killed. He knew they were representatives, that's the key word, representatives of the establishment, and he hated the establishment, but he didn't know the precise identity of these people. I'm reading the diary, and Oswald writes that he said, I've lived under capitalism, I've lived under communism, and I quote, despise the representatives of both systems, unquote. There's that representative. That maybe it was a representative type killing. And I told the jury in London that although Oswald may not have hated Kennedy, he hated the United States of America. He almost unquestionably viewed Kennedy as being the quintessential representative as the president of a society for which he held a grinding contempt, and that when he was firing his gun at Kennedy in his addled mind, he may have been firing at the United States of America. But you're never going to get an answer to that question because Oswald is dead. But I think this new thing that I've added is something that people should give some consideration.
Absolutely. Very insightful. We're talking to famed prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi. As maybe, well, certainly one of the most successful prosecutors ever in this country. I'm curious to know, and I know this may open too wide an area, and we're running out of time here, but we've talked before about Jim Garrison. But I would like to try this question on you. As I said, as a very successful prosecutor, did Jim Garrison ever have, in your view, based on your investigation, good intentions?
Did he ever have what?
Good intentions.
One of the reporters for the States Item newspaper in New Orleans, I think her last name was James. In any event, she said, he started out being a sincere, intelligent, kind of an eccentric guy, and he ended up being a lunatic. There is no question that little by little, he ended up becoming a very dishonorable public official. I mean, he bribed witnesses. He intimidated witnesses. He hypnotized witnesses. Members of his staff quit on him. Interesting thing is that the conspiracy buffs, have been screaming conspiracy for years. No one was listening to them. Then all of a sudden, someone on the inside, a member of the establishment, DA of New Orleans, started saying the same thing they were. So they flocked down to New Orleans like the sparrows do to, or the swallows do to San Juan Capistrano. But even they, the majority of them, and I have quotes from them in my book, decided to leave when they saw that, it was one thing to believe in a conspiracy, But to frame an obviously innocent man, Clay Shaw, that was too much for them, and they left. Now, there were a couple that stayed, like Mark Lane.
Yep.
But the majority of them left. They said, this is unbelievable. Long answer to your question, I think at one point he knew, he may have still believed there was a conspiracy, but he knew that what he was doing was 100% wrong. And maybe it was a situation in his mind of the ends justifying the means. I don't know. But he had no evidence at all. This guy was completely innocent, Clay Shaw.
Well, and the great irony, of course, is that he's made basically the hero of JFK, the motion picture, and Oliver Stone, a man who likes to think he prides himself on revealing and exposing abuses of power, makes a hero out of the guy who was the ultimate power abuser in what he did to other lives in the course of that investigation. That's what I find mind-blowing about Stone picking Garrison as sort of the guy.
Yeah, well, it's similar to Mark Lane. Mark Lane was traveling all over the world, acting like he was on a white horse, and he was fighting for justice, and the Warren Commission was suppressing the truth. And then they subpoena him, they pay his way back, and he refuses to answer questions in front of the Warren Commission. And I think it was Gerald Ford or another member of the Warren Commission said, you know, in our 10 months of hearings and things like that, I only saw Warren get angry one time, and that was with Mark Lane. So here's this guy fighting for justice, and yet when they bring him back, he doesn't want to answer any questions. I debated Lane once, actually 3 times, but this one here is what I'm going to tell you about. There was an uneducated, not a very intelligent waitress, Helen Markham. Helen Markham saw Lee Harvey Oswald shoot and kill Officer J.D. Tippett of the Dallas Police Department. And the Warren Commission knew that Lane had a tape-recorded conversation with Markham, and they asked him for that tape, and he just refused to give it. They finally, under a threat of contempt, got that tape from him. So I'm debating him in front of Simmons College in Boston several years ago, a pro-conspiracy audience, and I started reading to the audience what Lane was doing with this poor woman, and he was literally trying to put words in her mouth, trying to get her to give a description of the killer different from Lee Harvey Oswald. Well, was he fat? No, he wasn't fat. Well, was he just a little fat? And did he have curly hair? No. Well, was his hair just a little curly? And you know, when you're in an audience and someone is being embarrassed on stage, you kind of avert the glance because you're embarrassed for them. And I said, have I said enough? And the audience said, yeah. It became very clear. They didn't want to hear anymore. But Lane has been the main person throughout the years that has propounded the conspiracy theory, and there's just no question that he has told one distortion of the evidence after another, and he was doing everything in his power to get this woman to give a description of Tippett's killer different from the one that fit Lee Harvey Oswald. I went off on a tangent from your question.
No, it's called, I think it's called leading the witness, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yeah.
And he was doing a lot of that. Let's finish up with this, because we're running out of time. We're chatting with Vince Bugliosi, the famed prosecutor. I do sense, though, in fact, some of the folks who have reviewed your books on this have admitted that, I was one of those conspiracy guys. I was convinced this is the book that has convinced me. Now, I know there's still a large percentage that's never going to be convinced.
Right.
But what is what's the lesson from this story as we finish up? Is there a lesson to be learned about the way this thing has played out? And, in fact, has it not been fair to say that you have won some people over who previously said, I was militant on this, but sooner or later I had to start paying attention to people who are dealing in facts, not supposition and speculation?
Well, if I have any strength, one of my strengths is that I know my limitations. So when you ask me to make an observation that gets into sociological stuff, what can we learn from this? I kind of retreat on that. I do want to read one review from a Secret Service expert and former JFK conspiracy theorist. His name is Vince Bugliosi, and he's an exception because most of these people are not going to be convinced by anything. But he says, Vince Bugliosi's masterful Reclaiming History is a devastating knockout blow to those who, like me, once believed there was a conspiracy in the death of JFK. Bugliosi finishes and completes in exhaustive and impressive detail the work of the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and, quite frankly, all the other writers who have ever delved into the crime of the 20th century. It is time to get a life, America. Oswald did indeed kill Kennedy, acting alone. Vince Bugliosi has done what I once thought was the impossible. He has convinced me of this notion. The conspiracy community was able to survive the Warren Commission report as well as the report of the House Select Committee on Assassinations. The question is whether it will be able to survive Bugliosi's Reclaiming History. Well, it is surviving quite well. Thank you. Here's another one from a leading conspiracy theorist, Dr. David Mantik. It is likely that Reclaiming History will stand forever as the magnum opus of this case. It is a masterpiece. But by and large, the conspiracy community is still alive and doing well and having their conventions. And I've become the enemy, I guess. I don't know. Credibility means everything to me as a prosecutor and a writer of true crime. And everything I have in that book, I state the conspiracy view the way they want it to be stated, and then I knock it down. I don't distort. That's not my style. I just don't do that. So the book is it may not be 100% accurate. There may be things in there that are not accurate, but everything is written with a tremendous amount of support. I have over 10,000 citations, believed to be the most in any nonfiction book. It had been believed that the Warren Report, with 6,500 citations, was the highest. I have over 10,000 citations. So if there's any error in the book, it's not on anything important, and it was unintentional.